I never imagined the people who taught me how to walk would one day sit across from me in a courtroom, staring at me like I was their enemy. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers being shuffled and the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Every second felt heavier than the last. My hands were trembling, not because I was afraid of the judge, but because my parents were right there, watching me fall. They didn't look sad. They didn't look conflicted. They looked prepared. Across the room, their lawyer stood confidently, folders stacked neatly in front of him. This wasn't an argument. This was an execution, and I was the target. I could feel the eyes on me, strangers, observers, people who had no idea that the ones trying to destroy my life were the same people who once tucked me into bed and told me they loved me. My parents claimed they were protecting what was rightfully theirs. They said I was irresponsible. They said I was ungrateful. They said I deserved this. And worst of all, everyone was listening. The lawyer began listing numbers, debts, assets, accusations. Each word felt like a knife, carving away my reputation, my dignity, my future. He spoke calmly, professionally, as if he were discussing a business transaction, not the complete ruin of a human being. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and ask them why. Why now? Why like this? Why in front of everyone? But I stayed silent. Because when your own parents accuse you, words stop working. I looked at them, hoping, just for a second, that one of them would avoid my eyes, that one of them would hesitate, that I would see some sign of regret. There was none. That's when I realized something terrifying. They hadn't come to win. They had come to humiliate me. This wasn't about money. This was about control, about proving that I was nothing without them. The judge listened quietly as the accusations piled up. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just watched, took notes, let them talk. And the longer he stayed silent, the more convinced my parents became that they were winning. Their lawyer finished and sat down, confident. The room buzzed with a strange tension, like everyone already knew the outcome. I felt exposed, stripped, judged. Then the judge looked up. He adjusted his glasses. He glanced at my parents, then at me, and he asked a single question. One question that changed everything. A question so simple, yet so devastating, that the entire courtroom froze. My parents didn't answer right away, because for the first time that day, they were the ones who had no defense. And that's when I understood. They had come to destroy me, but they had forgotten one thing. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. Before that day, I believed there were lines their parents would never cross. Arguments, disappointment, even distance. I thought those were the worst things a family could face. I was wrong. Some families don't just break you emotionally. They study you. They wait. And when the moment is right, they strike in a way that leaves no visible bruises, only permanent damage. What happened to me didn't start in a courtroom. It started years earlier, quietly, in conversations that felt normal at the time. My parents had always been careful with words. They praised obedience and punished independence. Any decision I made without their approval was labeled selfish. Any success that didn't involve them was treated like betrayal. When I began building my own life, my own finances, my own future, the tone changed. The warmth disappeared. Questions turned into interrogations. Support became surveillance. I didn't realize it then, but they were keeping score. Every conversation became transactional. How much I earned, what I owned, who I trusted. They knew more about my finances than I did. Not because I asked, but because they demanded to know. And I told myself it was normal. Because they were my parents. The first threat came disguised as concern. They said I was making reckless decisions, that I didn't understand money, that without them, I would fail. They offered help, but it came with conditions: control, access, obedience. When I refused, something in them shifted. Not anger. Calculation. From that moment on, I wasn't their child anymore. It was a problem to be managed. They began rewriting the story of my life to others. Friends, relatives, even business contacts. I was suddenly unstable, irresponsible, difficult. They planted doubt everywhere, so that when the real attack came, no one would question it. And then, one day, I received a legal notice. Not a warning. Not a conversation. A formal document accusing me of financial misconduct signed by a lawyer my parents had hired. That's how I learned they weren't trying to guide me anymore. They were trying to erase me. The lawsuit was designed to do one thing: bankrupt me publicly, drain my resources, destroy my credibility, force me back into dependence, or silence me completely. They claimed I owed them, that I had misused funds, that everything I had built was only possible because of them. Lies wrapped in legal language. Cold, precise, ruthless. What hurt the most wasn't the accusations, it was the confidence behind them. They believed the system would protect them. And they were right, at least at first. When the court date arrived, I walked in alone. No support. No witnesses willing to stand beside me. Just whispers behind my back and eyes full of judgment. My parents arrived together, calm, composed, as if attending a business meeting. They never looked at me. To them, I wasn't family anymore. I was an obstacle. As the hearing began, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't about justice. It was about power, about proving they could take everything from me and still be seen as the victims. But what they didn't expect, what none of us expected, was that truth has a way of resurfacing in the most uncomfortable moments. Because while they had prepared documents, accusations, and witnesses, they hadn't prepared for one thing: a judge who listened. And a question that exposed There was never a single moment when my childhood broke apart. No explosion. No screaming match that marked the beginning of the end. What happened to me was quieter than that. Slower. More deliberate. Like water seeping into cracks you don't notice until the foundation starts to collapse. My parents were not cruel in obvious ways. They were careful, controlled, strategic, the kind of people others admired for being strict but loving, the kind that friends envied, the kind no one would ever suspect. Growing up, obedience was praised as virtue. Independence, however, was framed as danger. Whenever I followed instructions without question, I was rewarded with approval, warmth, a sense of belonging. But the moment I questioned anything, even gently, the atmosphere changed. Silence replaced affection. Disappointment hung in the air like fog. They didn't yell. They didn't punish openly. They withdrew. And I learned very early that love in our home was conditional. I remember the first time I made a decision on my own. It was small, insignificant really. But I could see it in their eyes, the shift, the way their expressions tightened, the way they asked questions that weren't really questions at all. Why would you do that without asking us? Who told you that was a good idea? Do you think you know better than your own parents? They said it calmly, reasonably, as if they were only trying to help. And I believed them because children always believe their parents. Over time, those questions became statements. You're too impulsive. You don't think things through. You'd be lost without us. At first, I resisted internally. I knew I wasn't reckless. I knew I was capable. But repetition is powerful. And when the same voices speak long enough, even truth begins to sound like doubt. They framed control as protection. They insisted on knowing everything: where I was going, who I was with, what my plans were. Not out of curiosity, they said, but concern. And whenever I hesitated, they reminded me of everything they had done for me. We just want what's best for you. After all we've sacrificed. Gratitude became a leash. As I grew older, the conditioning evolved. Emotional dependence was no longer enough. They needed leverage. Money became the new language of control. They offered financial support, but it always came with strings. Attached, access, oversight, approval. They insisted it was normal for parents to be involved, responsible even. And once again, I agreed, because disagreeing meant conflict, and conflict meant withdrawal. They knew exactly how much I earned, where it came from, where it went. They asked for numbers, documents, explanations. They framed it as guidance. You don't understand finances like we do. You're too trusting. You'll get taken advantage of. What they never said but always implied was that without them, I would fail. And slowly, subtly, my confidence eroded. I began second-guessing myself. Decisions that once felt natural now felt dangerous. I found myself seeking approval before acting, not because I needed it, but because I feared the consequences of acting alone. That's how they trained me, not with force, with doubt. When I finally started building something of my own, my career, my savings, my future, the shift became unmistakable. Success, instead of being celebrated, was questioned. How did you manage that? Who helped you? Are you sure this is sustainable? They smiled while they asked, but their eyes didn't. Every achievement that didn't involve them felt like an accusation, like proof that I might not need them anymore. And that terrified them. That's when the warmth disappeared completely. Conversations became interrogations. Casual check-ins turned into audits. They wanted updates, explanations, forecasts. They kept mental records of everything, every asset, every connection. I didn't realize it then, but they were keeping score. And behind my back, they were doing something far worse. They were rewriting my story. To relatives, I was struggling. To friends, I was confused. To anyone who would listen, I was making bad choices. They spoke with concern, with sadness, with disappointment, never with anger. That's what made it believable. By the time I noticed the shift in how people looked at me, the hesitation, the subtle judgment, the narrative was already set. Doubt had been planted everywhere, and I was the last to know. The first real threat didn't sound like a threat at all. It sounded like advice. They sat me down and told me they were worried, that they had been talking to professionals, that they feared I was putting myself and them at risk. You don't see it, but we do. We're trying to save you from yourself. They suggested legal and financial solutions, structures that would place my assets under their oversight. Safeguards, they called them. I called them cages. When I refused, something inside them hardened. Not anger, not disappointment. Calculation. Their tone changed. Their patience vanished. The affection they once rationed now disappeared entirely. I was no longer their child, I was a liability. From that moment on, everything they did had a purpose. Every conversation felt rehearsed. Every interaction carried an edge. I could sense something forming beneath the surface, but I didn't yet understand its shape. I only knew one thing: whatever was coming. They had been preparing for it far longer than I realized, and I was walking straight into it, armed. There is a moment when concern stops being care and becomes control. I didn't recognize it when it happened. By the time I did, it was already everywhere. At first, it was subtle. A question here, a comment there, always wrapped in the same tone, calm, reasonable, almost loving. Just keep us informed. We need to know, in case something happens. You never know when you'll need us. They said it as if transparency were proof of trust. As if privacy were something reckless people demanded. And once again, I complied, because refusing would only confirm what they were already telling others about me. That I was hiding something. My phone started ringing more often. Missed calls were questioned, delays explained. If I didn't respond quickly enough, the worry turned sharp. Why didn't you answer? Who were you with? Why didn't you tell us first? There was always an implication beneath the words, you owe us access. Soon, it wasn't just where I was, it was who I spoke to. They wanted names, backgrounds, intentions. Every new relationship was treated like a potential threat. Friends were evaluated, colleagues were dissected. Anyone who encouraged my independence was quietly discredited. They don't really care about you. They're using you. They don't understand how fragile your situation is. Slowly, people around me began to disappear, not because they left, but because I learned it was easier to pull away than to explain why my parents needed to know everything. Isolation doesn't always look like loneliness. Sometimes, it looks like peace that feels slightly wrong. Then came the finances. What started as guidance turned into oversight. Suggestions became requirements. They insisted on reviewing accounts, transactions, contracts. They claimed it was for my protection, that mistakes could cost me everything, and when I hesitated, they reminded me of the stories they had already told others. You know how people see you. If something goes wrong, they'll blame us. We're just trying to prevent disaster. Fear became the currency. They wanted passwords, statements, explanations for expenses that weren't theirs to question. Every purchase was analyzed, every decision scrutinized. If something didn't align with their expectations, it became evidence of my incompetence. I began to feel like a suspect in my own life. Whenever I pushed back, even gently, the reaction was immediate, not explosive, calculated. They sighed. They expressed disappointment. They spoke about stress, about sleepless nights, about how worried they were. You're doing this to us. Why are you making things so difficult? And just like that, the blame shifted. I started apologizing for things I hadn't done wrong, explaining choices that didn't require justification, defending myself against accusations that existed only in their imagination. That's how gaslighting works. It doesn't erase reality, it replaces it. The more successful I became, the tighter the grip grew. Any financial progress triggered new concerns, new warnings, new demands. They questioned the legitimacy of my work, the sustainability of my income, the people I worked with. They made it sound like an intervention. We're afraid you're overestimating yourself. This kind of growth attracts attention. You could get into serious trouble. But beneath the concern was something else, something colder. They were afraid of losing leverage because money meant options, and options meant escape. Behind the scenes, they were still talking, still planting seeds, still shaping perceptions. I found out later that they had contacted people in my professional circle casually, politely asking questions that carried quiet accusations. Have you noticed unusual behavior? Does everything seem legitimate? We're just worried. By the time rumors reached me, they had already mutated. Doubt had become suspicion. Concern had become judgment. And I didn't even know I was on trial yet. Every attempt I made to establish boundaries was treated as proof that I was unstable, that I was hiding something, that I couldn't be trusted. The irony was cruel. The more I tried to protect myself, the more they portrayed me as dangerous. I began living in a state of constant tension. Every call felt like a test. Every conversation felt recorded, even when it wasn't. I weighed my words carefully, knowing they could be repeated, reframed, weaponized. Home stopped feeling safe. Silence stopped feeling neutral. I could sense that something was coming, but not what or when. The first sign that things had crossed into something irreversible came during a conversation that should have been ordinary. They asked me, casually, if I had considered formalizing certain arrangements. Legal structures, documentation, oversight, just to be safe, they said. When I refused clearly, firmly, without apology, the room changed. For the first time, they didn't try to persuade me. They simply nodded and smiled. That smile stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because it wasn't disappointment, it wasn't concern. It was confirmation. From that moment on, communication shifted. Messages became shorter, colder, delayed. They stopped asking questions not because they had stopped caring, but because they had stopped needing answers. They already had what they wanted. I didn't know it then, but they were documenting everything. Collecting fragments, building a narrative piece by piece, every hesitation, every refusal, every boundary. Evidence not of wrongdoing, but of disobedience, and in their minds, disobedience was the only crime that mattered. The legal notice didn't arrive out of nowhere. It arrived exactly when it was meant to. But before the envelope ever reached my hands, the damage was already done. Trust dismantled, reputation weakened, support systems quietly erased. They had isolated me emotionally. Now they were preparing to isolate me legally. And when the system finally moved against me, I would be standing alone. The envelope arrived on an ordinary morning. No warning, no call, no final conversation, just paper. At first, I didn't recognize the sender. A law firm name printed neatly at the top, formal, impersonal. I remember standing there, holding it, feeling a strange sense of distance, as if whatever was inside belonged to someone else's life. Then, I opened it. The words were precise, cold, unapologetic. Accusations laid out in clean paragraphs, stripped of emotion, wrapped in legal certainty. Financial misconduct, misuse of funds, breach of trust. Claims detailed enough to sound credible, vague enough to be dangerous. And at the bottom of the page, their names. My parents, not mentioned as witnesses, not as concerned parties, as plaintiffs. That was the moment reality fractured. I read the document again and again, each time hoping I had misunderstood. Each time realizing I hadn't. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't pressure, this was war declared quietly, formally, and without hesitation. They weren't trying to scare me, they were trying to erase me. The lawsuit was engineered with precision. Every accusation echoed the narrative they had been spreading for years. That I was irresponsible, that I couldn't be trusted, that I had taken advantage of their support, that everything I had built belonged to them. It was the same story, only now it had teeth. I reached out, once, carefully, calmly. I asked them why. They didn't respond. That silence told me everything I needed to know. Within days, the impact spread, accounts flagged, contracts questioned, relationships strained. People who once spoke to me freely now kept their distance. Some avoided me entirely. Others spoke in cautious tones as if I were contagious. The system moves fast when doubt already exists, and they had made sure doubt was everywhere. I contacted a lawyer. Not because I believed the accusations, but because I understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about money, it was about credibility, about survival. As the legal process unfolded, I saw the full scope of what they had prepared. Documents, emails, statements taken out of context, conversations reframed, decisions twisted into motives. They had been collecting material for years, patiently, waiting for the moment it would be most effective. They knew my habits, my patterns, my weaknesses. They used everything. What shocked me most wasn't the scale of the attack, was the confidence behind it. They believed the law would protect them, that their role as parents would grant them automatic credibility, that I would be seen as the reckless child they had described for so long. And in many ways, they were right. The first hearing date was set quickly, too quickly. I barely had time to breathe before I was standing in a courthouse hallway, surrounded by strangers who knew my name but not my story. My parents arrived together. They looked composed, calm, almost relieved, like people who had finally taken control of a long-delayed situation. They didn't acknowledge me, didn't look in my direction. They spoke quietly with their lawyer, nodding along as if reviewing a business proposal. I realized then that they had already detached. This wasn't emotional for them, it was procedural. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Observers filled the benches, some curious, some judgmental. I could feel eyes on me before the hearing even began. Whispers passed behind me like drafts of cold air. The lawyer representing my parents spoke first. He was smooth, confident. He laid out their version of events with clinical efficiency. A concerned family, a troubled adult child, financial irresponsibility, betrayal of trust. The language was devastating precisely because it sounded reasonable. He spoke as if the outcome were inevitable, as if I were already guilty. I sat there, listening, feeling something inside me shrink with every sentence. Not because I believed the accusations, but because I understood how convincing they sounded to people who didn't know me. This is how reputations die. Not with proof, with narrative. When it was my turn to respond, my voice felt foreign in my own throat. I explained. Clarified, corrected, but explanations don't land the same way accusations do. They don't echo, they don't linger, and I could feel it, the room leaning away from me. The judge listened quietly, took notes, asked no questions, gave nothing away. That silence was unbearable, because silence in a courtroom feels like judgment. My parents sat motionless as the hearing progressed, no emotion, no hesitation. They didn't flinch when the lawyer spoke about my alleged failures. They didn't react when my name was dissected, reshaped, reduced to a list of claims. To them, this was the final step of a long process. After the session ended, people avoided my eyes. Some nodded politely. Others pretended not to see me. I walked out alone. That was the moment it truly hit me. They hadn't just taken me to court. They had positioned me as a liability. Every step afterward felt heavier. Legal fees mounted. Stress seeped into everything. Sleep became fragmented. Food lost its taste. Conversations felt distant, unreal. I began questioning myself, not my innocence, but my resilience. How long could I keep fighting? How much could I lose before there was nothing left to defend? And still, they said nothing. No messages, no explanations, no acknowledgement. The silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. They wanted me exhausted, isolated, desperate. They wanted me to settle, to concede, to come back to them not as an equal, but as someone broken enough to submit. That's what this was always about, control. As the next hearing approached, the pressure intensified. More filings, more allegations, more people pulling away. The narrative they had built was working exactly as intended. I felt exposed, publicly dismantled, stripped of privacy and dignity. But beneath the fear, something else began to form: clarity. For the first time, I stopped asking why they were doing this and started asking how far they were willing to go. Because whatever they believed, whatever they had planned, one thing was becoming painfully clear. They hadn't prepared for resistance. And they hadn't prepared for the truth to be examined closely, carefully, by someone who wasn't invested in their version of events. The courtroom wasn't finished with us yet, and the most dangerous moment of all was still ahead. The court session had ended abruptly. The judge had asked the question that changed everything, but it was still just a whisper in the air. The echo of his voice, the pause after the words were spoken, hung between my parents and me, as if it were a brief moment of truth in the middle of a long, painful game. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because for the first time in years, someone had seen through their manipulation, through their coldness, through the layers of control they had wrapped around me. But dread, because I knew this was far from over. The legal battle was just beginning, and now everything was on the line. Not just my finances, but my future, my identity, my very sense of self. I tried to call a few people, friends, acquaintances, but no one answered. My world had become a place where silence was the loudest noise, and the only thing that could fill the void was my own thoughts, spiraling out of control. What did this mean for me? Would the judge's question truly make a difference? Could I really escape this web of lies? Or was I destined to be trapped forever in this ugly family drama? At home, the walls felt even more suffocating. It had only been a few days since the court session, but already the pressure was mounting. My phone buzzed with text messages from my parents, messages from people who had been contacted by them. I could feel their presence, like shadows creeping into every part of my life. They were still watching, still controlling. One of the first things I did was hire a lawyer of my own. It felt like a desperate move, but it was also empowering. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. Not without a fight. I needed someone who understood this nightmare, someone who could navigate the system and give me a fighting chance. I walked into the lawyer's office that afternoon, feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. My lawyer, Michael, was a calm, methodical man who had seen his share of family disputes, but nothing quite like mine. He looked through the legal documents, His brow furrowed as he flipped through the pages. "I've never seen a case quite like this before," he said, his voice low and steady. "Your parents have gone to extreme lengths, but we have something they don't: the truth." His words were a brief glimmer of hope, but it was still hard to shake off the feeling that I was already walking through a fog of betrayal and loss. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on me, as though I were standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the world fall away below me. But the next few days brought something unexpected, something I hadn't anticipated. The truth began to unravel in the most bizarre and unsettling way. One evening, as I was sifting through papers at home, an old letter fell out of an envelope. It was addressed to me, written in my mother's handwriting. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. As I read it, my heart pounded in my chest. The letter was from years ago, long before any of this had started. In it, my mother talked about the plans they had for me, about the future they envisioned, about how they would make sure I stayed on track. It was laced with language that seemed loving at first, but now, in the context of everything that had happened, it sounded like a blueprint for manipulation. "I'm doing this for you," the letter read. "Everything I do is to ensure you have the best life. Sometimes, you might not understand my decisions, but trust that they're for your own good. Trust that you'll thank me one day." I stared at the letter, feeling a wave of disgust and disbelief wash over me. How had I not seen this before? How had I missed the signs? It was like I was reading the words of someone who didn't care about me at all. Someone who had been preparing for this moment of control and power long before I ever suspected anything. And then it hit me. The battle was never about money. It was about control. They had never seen me as a daughter, never as a person with her own rights or desires. I was just a project, a possession, a means to an end. And now they were trying to destroy everything I had worked for in order to reassert that control. The next day, I called Michael to tell him about the letter. It wasn't a smoking gun. No, it wasn't evidence in the legal sense. But it was a window into their mindset. It showed just how far they were willing to go to make me their puppet. It gave me a deeper understanding of the psychological game they were playing. "You're not alone in this," Michael said when I shared the letter with him. "We'll use this. We'll turn the tables on them." And just like that, a spark of determination ignited in me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had a chance to take control back. But I knew the road ahead would be long and grueling. My parents were powerful, ruthless, and they had the full force of the law on their side. They wouldn't go down without a fight. The next hearing was scheduled for the following week, and I had to prepare myself for the storm that was about to hit. I didn't know what to expect, what new tricks they would pull, what new lies they would tell. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to let them win. The silence in my life was deafening, but I was no longer alone. I had the truth on my side, and I had a team that believed in me. The world was watching, and I knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. The second hearing arrived faster than I expected. By then, the damage was visible, not just on paper, but on me. I had lost weight without trying. Sleep came in fragments. My thoughts moved in circles, replaying conversations, documents, expressions. I felt like I was constantly bracing for impact, even in moments of silence. That morning, as I stood outside the courthouse, I realized something unsettling. I no longer feared losing the case as much as I feared losing myself. Inside, everything felt familiar now. The benches, the cold air, the subtle hum of tension that never truly left the room. My parents were already there again, seated together, whispering to their lawyer. Calm, composed, almost bored. They looked like people who believed the outcome was already decided. And maybe that was the most terrifying part. The hearing unfolded like a performance rehearsed to perfection. Their lawyer spoke with confidence, reinforcing the same narrative, only this time with more polish. He referenced previous statements, selectively quoted emails, highlighted financial movements stripped of context. He didn't accuse loudly, he suggested quietly, and suggestion, I was learning, was far more dangerous. Each sentence pushed me further into a corner. Each pause felt intentional, as if designed to let doubt settle into the room. I watched the faces around me as the story took shape. Some nodded. Others frowned slightly, not in disbelief but in concern. Concern for them, not for me. When my turn came, I spoke carefully, measured, calm. I resisted the urge to defend myself emotionally, knowing that emotion would only confirm the image they had created. Still, I could feel how fragile my position was. Truth doesn't always sound convincing when it's competing with the story people are already prepared to believe. The judge listened. Again, silent, observant, unreadable. That silence began to feel less neutral and more ominous. At one point, I glanced at my parents. My mother's hands were folded neatly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead. Neither of them looked at me, not once. It was as if I no longer existed as a person, only as a problem being resolved. And that was the illusion they had built so carefully. That this was reasonable, that this was necessary, that this was inevitable. As the hearing drew to a close, the judge announced that he would need time to review additional materials before making any determinations. No ruling, no reassurance. Just more waiting. More uncertainty. Walking out of the courtroom that day felt worse than the first time. The absence of resolution was heavier than any verdict could have been. It allowed doubt to grow unchecked. Outside, people lingered, some spoke quietly, others avoided eye contact. I overheard fragments of conversation, half-formed opinions, assumptions, conclusions drawn without evidence. That was when I truly understood the brilliance of their strategy. They didn't need to win immediately. They just needed to make me look questionable long enough. Doubt was doing their work for them. Over the following days, the pressure intensified. Financial institutions requested additional documentation. Professional opportunities stalled. People who once returned my calls immediately now took days or didn't respond at all. I wasn't convicted of anything, but I was already being treated like I was, and my parents knew it. They sent one message during that time, just one. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't threatening. It was worse. "We don't want this to go any further," it read. Still a way to resolve this peacefully. I knew exactly what they meant. Surrender, compliance, return to dependence. They weren't offering peace. They were offering silence at the cost of my autonomy. I didn't respond. That refusal marked a turning point. From that moment on, their approach shifted again. Subtly, but unmistakably. New filings appeared. New claims surfaced. The narrative evolved, adapting, reinforcing itself, tightening the trap. They were running out of patience, and I was running out of room. The next hearing was scheduled to be decisive. Final arguments, final evaluations. The point at which everything could tip one way or the other. In the days leading up to it, I barely spoke to anyone. I reviewed documents obsessively, replayed timelines, questioned every memory, every choice, every moment where I might have unknowingly given them leverage. That's when fear reached its peak. Not fear of losing money, not fear of losing status, fear of being permanently defined by a lie. The night before the hearing, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in silence, staring at nothing, wondering how something so deeply personal had become so publicly violent, how love had turned into strategy, how family had turned into opposition. The following morning, I walked into the courtroom knowing one thing for certain. This was the moment they believed they would finally win. They had witnesses. They had documents. They had narrative momentum. What they didn't have, what they had never truly accounted for, was scrutiny. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, the judge didn't open the session by addressing the lawyers. He looked directly at my parents. He adjusted his glasses, and he asked a question, a single question, one they hadn't prepared for. And in that moment, the illusion they had worked so hard to maintain began to crack. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt different from before, not tense, not heavy. Focused. The judge leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the bench. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the documents stacked beside him. His eyes were fixed on my parents. And then he asked it. A simple question, calmly spoken, carefully chosen. Can you explain why, if your child was truly reckless and untrustworthy, you waited years until they became financially independent to take legal action? The silence that followed was absolute. No shifting in seats, no whispers, no rustle of paper. For the first time since this nightmare began, my parents looked unprepared. Their lawyer straightened, clearly caught off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. This question wasn't about numbers or documents. It wasn't something that could be answered with charts or statements. It was about motive. My mother spoke first. She said they had always been concerned, that they had tried to guide me, that they only acted when they believed the situation had become unsafe. Her voice was steady, but something in her tone had changed. It lacked conviction. The judge listened without interrupting. Then he asked another question. If that's the case, why did you continue encouraging financial autonomy until the moment your child refused to transfer control to you? My father shifted, just slightly, enough to be noticed. The judge wasn't attacking them, he was dissecting the story. Piece by piece, he turned to their lawyer and asked him to clarify the timeline. When concerns were first raised, when legal consultations began, when documents were drafted. As the answers came, a pattern emerged. Concern appeared only after independence. Legal action followed refusal. Escalation aligned perfectly with loss of control. The illusion cracked. I watched as the room subtly changed. Heads tilted. Brows furrowed. People who had entered expecting a story of irresponsibility were now witnessing something far more uncomfortable. Intent. The judge turned his attention to the documents presented as evidence, emails, messages, financial records. He asked why certain communications, ones that showed encouragement, approval, even praise, had been omitted from the initial filings. The lawyer hesitated. For the first time, hesitation mattered. My parents were asked to explain discrepancies, to justify selective narratives, to clarify contradictions they hadn't anticipated would be examined so closely. Their confidence drained visibly. This wasn't a hostile interrogation. It was worse. It was calm exposure. The judge paused, then asked the question that changed everything. Isn't it true that this action was initiated not to protect yourselves from harm, but to regain leverage you believed you had lost? No one moved. My mother's face went pale. My father stared at the table in front of him. The lawyer shifted into damage control mode, offering explanations that sounded increasingly hollow. That was the moment the courtroom understood. This wasn't about financial misconduct. It was about punishment. Punishment for independence. Punishment for refusal. Punishment for no longer submitting. The judge leaned back, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke. He said the court was not a tool for enforcing obedience. That parental authority did not extend indefinitely into adulthood. That financial disputes require evidence, not assumptions built on entitlement. He said something else too, something I will never forget. Control is not concern, he said, and retaliation is not justice. The ruling followed. The claims were dismissed, not partially, not temporarily, completely. The court found no evidence of misconduct, no justification for the timing or severity of the action. The case was deemed an abuse of process. The words echoed through the room. Abuse of process. My parents sat frozen. The people who had once avoided my eyes now looked directly at me, some with shock, some with regret. Some with understanding that came too late, but came nonetheless. The judge concluded by warning against future actions of a similar nature. And just like that, it was over. No dramatic outburst, no shouting, no apology. Just truth spoken clearly, officially, and permanently. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter, sharper, real. My parents walked past me without a word. They didn't look defeated. They looked exposed. And exposure, I learned, is far more painful than loss. In the weeks that followed, the damage didn't vanish overnight. Reputations don't rebuild instantly. Trust doesn't return on command. But something fundamental had shifted. People reached out, quietly, carefully. Some apologized. Others simply listened. The narrative they had accepted began to unravel, replaced by a far more unsettling realization that manipulation doesn't always look cruel. Sometimes it looks respectable. As for my parents, they never acknowledged what they had done. No apology came, no apology followed, but they never tried again. And that was enough. Because winning wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming reality. I learned something through all of this, something I wish I had understood earlier. Some families don't want you to succeed. They want you to remain accessible, dependent, controllable, grateful. And when you refuse, they will call it betrayal. But independence is not betrayal. Boundaries are not cruelties. And walking away from manipulation is not abandonment. It is survival. If you're listening to this story and it feels familiar, if you've ever been made to doubt yourself by the very people who were supposed to protect, you know this. You are not imagining it. You are not overreacting, and you are not wrong for choosing yourself. Because sometimes, the most painful truth is also the most liberating one. Family should never require your silence in exchange for peace. And anyone who demands that was never protecting you to begin with. If this story made you feel anger, confusion, or recognition, you're not alone. Many people suffer silently inside their own families and no one talks about it. If you've lived something similar, share this story. Leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths are too important to stay hidden.